Hello class, today we'll be workshopping Elizabeth's story. So we've all read the story, very creative Elizabeth, and written our feedback letters. Let's start at the beginning. Erin, what did you think of the opening? Well, I thought it was a little bit, dull. Not to be rude or anything, but did we really need to spend so much time describing the protagonist's knee pain? I mean, I thought he was complaining like a little too much. I didn't want to keep reading. Yes, Alyssa. I think what Erin is trying to say is that the entire opening is actually a cliche and should just be cut altogether. You're never supposed to start a story with the main character's morning routine. I mean, it's like writing 101, right? So I think this story should actually begin when the character arrives at the mine, on page 13. Oh wait, is this story only 16 pages long? I guess there's lots of room for expansion. Yeah, that's a good point. But is this a story about being in the mine, or is this a story about the character's home life? Well, the mine is the most interesting, so I think it should be about that. I agree, but he probably shouldn't be so old. I mean, why is this character still working in a mine at this age anyway? Hello friends, my name is Elizabeth, and today I'm going to tell you how to survive and thrive in a creative writing workshop. Now, it's important to start out by saying that you're going to have all levels in a creative writing workshop, even at the upper level courses. You know, all level of skill will be in the class. That's just the way it is. Some students will be better writers than the teacher, and some students will be worse than an 8-year-old. But all those people still add value to your workshop because they all bring their own unique voice and ideas and experience. So it's best not to secretly rank your class from worst writer to best writer, always trying to figure out where you fall in the line, at the top obviously. But instead try to view the class as a unique collection of voices that you yourself would never be able to create all on your own because you are just one person. Okay, so that's important to keep in mind. Now, let's get to the top 8 tips for surviving and thriving in a creative writing workshop. Tip number 1. Giving feedback is more important than getting feedback. If this is your first time signing up for a creative writing workshop, then that might not be what you were expecting. But it's true. For your development as a writer, giving feedback is more important than getting feedback. The most useful part of the class is actually editing other people's stories. For your own skills as a writer, that's the most important part of the class. Not your own story. So go into the class really planning to put your time and effort into giving other people feedback on their stories. Learn how to tear into a story, like not in a negative way, but in a mechanical way. Like seeing what makes a story tick, what's holding it together, what are its weak spots. That is the most essential aspect of any creative writing workshop. Being able to separate and identify a story's parts and be able to identify which ones are working and which ones are not working. It's much easier to do that in other people's stories because you have no attachment to them. It's much easier to look beneath the lid, behind the curtain, and figure out what's wrong with other people's stories rather than looking at your own precious baby. Because if you can really hone those skills, you can then transfer them to your own writing and then carry it with you throughout the rest of your writing career. And then, long after the class is over, you'll know how to take apart a story, identify its parts, its intention, and then also understand how to piece those parts back together again and add new parts in order to create the story that you really wanted to tell. You learn that through giving feedback, not from getting it. Tip number 2, learn whose feedback you value the most, but don't discount other ideas. In a class of say 15 or 20 students, there will probably be a few that you recognize as having a similar style to your own, who write along similar topics, or have a similar level of experience, or who tend to focus on the same storytelling aspects, like dialogue, or world building, or theme, or metaphor, or anything else that you also tend to focus on in your stories. More than likely, you will end up prioritizing those people's feedback over people who write wildly different types of fiction than you, or who have a wildly different level of experience writing than you. And you know, that's good, that's natural. The people who write in a similar style to the way that you write will probably have pretty solid ideas on how to strengthen your story, and they'll probably also be a little bit more likely to understand your intention with your story and help guide you better in that direction. But even from the students who perhaps haven't yet even learned that every story should contain at least a few paragraph breaks, so that you're not just presenting people with a wall of text to read, those people might still surprise you with creative solutions to include in your own story. So don't discount their feedback. You might not have ever thought up of their ideas on your own because you have wildly different brains, you know? You write wildly different things. So don't discount those people. Which brings me to tip number 3. Giving feedback is not rewriting. When giving feedback to the other writers in your workshop, try not to think, how would I write this so that it would sound better? But instead think, how can I help this writer better tell the story that they want to tell? You know, in their voice. What is this story's intention? Even if I don't agree, even if that's not how I would have written the story, what is this story's intention? and how can we better make it come alive for the reader. That's not only much more useful for the writer that you're critiquing, but it also helps you grow as a writer, more than simply asking how you would fix it. And the reason for that is that you would simply be rewriting their story, or a part of their story, the way that you write now, however flawed and novice that may be. No offense, I mean, you are in this class for a reason. But if you instead ask yourself, okay, what do I think the intentions of this author is? What is this story trying to be? And what might be a better, more coherent, streamlined, interesting, original way to tell that story? Then you are forcing yourself to really view the story mechanically and identify its parts, what it currently has and what it might be missing, which are its strong points and which points might be a little bit weaker. That type of identifying parts in a story is what will really propel you in your own growth as a writer, rather than simply rewriting their story into your own current style. There's a lot less learning going on there. Do you see? Tip number 4. Among all the people in your class, you should probably prioritize your teacher's feedback, since it will probably be better than the students' feedback. Now, I know when you're in the class, you're going to be sussing out the other students and who you feel might be closest to you in terms of style and experience, topic, and overall voice. But even with all of that, it's still likely that the professor will have the most structured, cohesive, industry-relevant feedback for your writing. That's just the nature of class. You know, the teacher knows best. Or at least, like, slightly more. Not only is the teacher more experienced, more than likely, but they've also probably published in some way and have gone through their own creative writing courses, as well as spent time communing with other industry professionals in order to understand what makes a strong story and how to best convey that to students. Just something to keep in mind in terms of whose feedback you might give more weight to if they're suggesting a major overhaul of your story. The professor probably knows what they're talking about, but it's also not a given. Like, this is a generality, a case-by-case basis. Like, just what you can probably expect from your creative writing teacher. But it might not always be true. Your creative writing professor, no matter how seasoned and decorated in the writing world, might simply not like your writing. I mean, they just might not take to it, even if you're following all the standard elements of strong storytelling. It is all still essentially opinion-based, and your teacher might just not like your writing. There's very little you can do about that, and it can also be really hard to tell if that is what is happening, or if your writing really is just a little bit subpar and you're just not yet able to recognize it. You know, that's a really hard thing to differentiate when it's happening to you. For example, when I was in college, I had one professor who told me I was one of the best writers she had ever had among the students in her classes. But a different professor, reading the same story that I had written for the earlier class, told me I shouldn't even bother applying to creative writing master's programs because I wouldn't get in. Like, that's how little she thought of my writing, that I just shouldn't even try applying. Which person do you think I listened to? That's right, the second one. And it literally derailed my writing career for years. Years. I stopped pursuing writing for literally years. Don't do that. Don't base your entire worth as a writer off of one person's opinion, no matter how esteemed they are in the writing world. And also, you know, whether or not they think you're the best thing since Shakespeare, or they think you're a waste of space, just don't do it. Don't value one person's opinion as the end-all be-all. Value all opinions as opinions, some perhaps more grounded in the storytelling structure than others, and then try to proceed accordingly. Revising your stories based off of the tenets of strong storytelling rather than any one person's tastes. Because I mean, that woman's voice is still in my head. I've buried it a little bit in the years, but that was a painful one. She told my writing was too earnest. What does that mean? Let me tell you, I spent like weeks trying to Google what is the opposite of earnest, and I couldn't find anything. The only thing I could find was like cynical. Is that what my goal is for my writing? I don't know. It doesn't feel like that should be my goal, but yeah. Apparently I write too earnestly. Now, in a similar vein to that, tip number 5, you might have to apply to courses. Like, you might have to submit a sample of your current writing to see if you're even up to par enough to take the class. It can be a stressful process. Usually higher level courses in a curriculum are the ones that this apply to, unless the intro level courses are taught by some celebrity writer, which can happen. But in a typical college campus, you'll only have to apply to the higher levels. And let me tell you, the first time I had to apply when I was in university, I did not get in. It was an upper level writing course, and it was crushing. The rejection was crushing. But alas, I ended up applying the following semester, and I got it. And it was a different teacher that time, and I ended up thoroughly enjoying the class. So, Just a reminder that rejection comes in all levels of writing, all forms, you know? It's not just submitting for publication. It's everywhere. But try not to let them get you down. Tip number 6. It's okay if you have to write something new for the class. Like, not a new story. You will have to write a new story, obviously, probably several. But like, in a new style. I mean, it's not a given in a creative writing class, but alright, let's just be real here for a second. I try not to stereotype, but depending on how old your professor is, you might be more likely to be forced to adhere to some stricter guidelines on the type of story you can write for the class. And I mean, not necessarily, we're talking generally here. If you have an old school professor, you just might have less leeway in the types of stories accepted in the class. But it really runs the gamut. I mean, you'll have professors who don't care what you write. You'll have some that actively encourage you to write speculative or genre fiction. You'll also have professors that might allow some slightly surreal elements in your otherwise contemporary story. And you might also have professors that require you to only write contemporary realistic fiction, without so much as experimenting in the second person, with the second person. You know, that's just people's tastes, everybody's different, and if you're in charge of the class, you get to decide. But even if you do end up with a more old school professor, I would still encourage you to not let that deter you from signing up. It's only one class, it's not the rest of your writing life. You don't have to change what you write forever. And you can actually really learn a lot of good technique when you're forced to write outside your comfort zone. Even if you end up with pieces that you don't necessarily want to include in your portfolio, because you don't really feel like they reflect you as a writer. You'll still be learning. The class might also feel a little bit more like school than a more open, anything goes type of class, but you really will still grow significantly as a writer. I promise. Tip number 7. Don't read feedback right away. Alright, so the way writing class workshops are typically structured is that each week, 1 or 2, potentially, students hand over copies of their story for everybody to take home and read, and then in the next class, their story is workshopped. So, you know, beforehand, all the students go home, and for homework, they read and revise the story, your story, so they can talk about them in the following class. There's also typically a written requirement, so like they have to write you a revision letter that they'll then give you after workshop. So, if you're the one whose story is being read, you don't have homework that week. You just sit home and stew, knowing that everybody else is reading and judging your work. Then, during the workshop, people go around and offer feedback and ask questions about each section of the story, usually led by the professor. So it's not like a free-for-all bashing scenario, but it can be stressful to feel like you're writing and you are under a microscope in that sort of way. Oh, and also typically the writer, you, are not allowed to speak during the workshop until the very, very end when you're allowed to answer questions. That just prevents writers from getting defensive and spending the whole class arguing rather than actually absorbing any kind of feedback. And it is actually good for you to learn how to take criticism on your writing. It helps you grow. It will also be a necessary skill for you to have if you ever plan on working with a professional editor, who won't just read everything you like and be like, I love it, no notes. That person would not last as a professional editor for very long. But after the workshop, everyone hands you their feedback so you can go over all the details later. You really need to wait until later. Emphasis on the later. Don't go home and drown yourself in everyone's feedback. You need time to cool off and let the comments mentioned in class swirl around a little in your head, becoming less painful and more helpful before you go in and actually see the nitty-gritty details of what people suggested about your work. Because the revision notes in the written form can be brutal. Most people write comments in the margins as they read, and then a cohesive revision letter at the end. And the comments in the margins are just a whole lot of, what? I don't understand this. This is boring. This is repetitive. This entire section is too cliche. Are you trying to sound so pretentious? And you don't need to be reading all of that hot off the tails of your workshop. Give yourself time. Your story will also benefit from you waiting to review other people's feedback until you're actually ready to accept and implement it. Tip number 8. Don't be afraid, or at least don't let the fear of being judged and discussed stop you from signing up for a creative writing workshop. I am the most fearful person on the planet. I have severe social anxiety. And I never actually found the workshop experience to be that terrible. I mean, I dreaded it the first couple of times it happened to me, and there are some hard parts, some learning experiences. But it really all is still good for your growth as a writer. Not just like to develop some thick skin in order to face the real world of constant rejection, but also just to simply learn how to take feedback and criticism and turn that into actual improvements in your story. It's a skill, and no one's born with it. It takes time to master. It's probably a lifelong thing, you know, lifelong learning. And the first few times you receive feedback on your stories, it will probably sting. But the sting really does lessen over time. I mean, it just does. It really does. Like, I remember in one of the first workshops I took in college, I wrote this story about a man visiting an old man in a nursing home, and the old man is cranky and complaining all the time. And then in the end, there's this really surreal moment where it turns out it was only one man the whole time, and it was just the old guy talking to his reflection in the nursing home. And he realizes he's not the young guy with his life ahead of him, but he is actually the cranky old guy. His life is over. I don't know, I was in college and it was experimental. But anyway, when I first got feedback back from the students in my class for my workshop, I remember one guy whose main primary feedback was how the entire story was offensive to old people. And when I read that, I was seriously, like, mortified. I was like, oh my gosh, I am a terrible person. Why did I ever believe that I should be allowed to write? And it haunted me for like a month, which is, a significant portion of the semester. But that was just one guy reviewing my first draft, It wasn't the Pulitzer Committee. It didn't have to pierce so deeply. So those are the types of learning experiences that are good for you and that you will have in a creative writing workshop. Personal growth and all that. Painful though. It can be painful.